Nobody told me that the day I stopped caring about how my body looked and started caring about how my mind felt was the day I finally became someone who actually keeps going. And I need to talk about why that shift changes everything. The moment everything changed, there was a specific period in my life where I was doing everything right on paper. Training consistently, tracking nutrition, getting enough sleep, hitting the metrics that fitness culture told me were the markers of someone who was serious about their health. And I was miserable. Not dramatically miserable. Not the kind of miserable that announces itself with obvious symptoms and clear causes. The quieter kind. The low-grade, persistent sense that something fundamental was not working. That despite the physical effort and the visible results, something in the quality of my daily experience was declining rather than improving. The anxiety that had always lived at the background level of my life was moving forward. The mental clarity I had assumed would come automatically with physical fitness was not arriving the way the fitness content I consumed had implied it would. The stress that accumulated during the week was not being resolved by weekend training sessions the way stress is supposed to be resolved by exercise, according to everything I had ever read about the subject. I was fit by most visible measures. I was not well by the measure that actually determined the quality of how I experienced every single day. And then something shifted, not dramatically, not through a single revelation, but through the gradual and uncomfortable recognition that I had been approaching exercise as a purely physical transaction and missing the most significant return it was actually capable of providing. I was training my body while my mind was starving for exactly the kind of structured, progressive, consistent attention I was directing entirely elsewhere. The day I redirected that attention, the day exercise became primarily about what it did to my neurological and psychological experience rather than what it did to my physical appearance, was the day the relationship with training changed completely. Not the training itself, the relationship with it. And that relationship is what this is actually about. What the research knows that fitness culture ignores. Here is something that does not get discussed honestly in mainstream fitness content because it does not sell programs or supplements particularly well. The most consistently documented benefit of regular exercise across decades of research, the benefit with the largest effect size, the broadest population applicability, and the most immediate onset is not aesthetic. It is not even primarily cardiovascular. It is psychological. The impact of consistent physical exercise on mood, anxiety, cognitive function, stress resilience, and the neurological architecture underlying emotional regulation is more thoroughly documented, more reliably reproducible, and more rapidly experienced than almost any other benefit the fitness industry leads with. And yet the industry leads with physique, because physique sells. The before and after photograph communicates a transformation that is visible, measurable, and emotionally compelling to a consumer audience. The equivalent before and after of a nervous system that has been progressively strengthened through consistent exercise, reduced baseline anxiety, improved stress response, enhanced working memory, more stable emotional regulation, does not photograph. But it is more life-changing than the photograph. For most people, significantly more. Here is what is actually happening in the brain during and after exercise, and why it matters more than any aesthetic outcome exercise produces. Every time you engage in sustained physical movement, your brain initiates a neurochemical event that is more targeted and more comprehensive than any pharmaceutical intervention designed to address the same systems. Dopamine rises, not the acute spike associated with reward and pleasure, but the more sustained elevation associated with motivation, drive, and the neurological capacity to pursue goals without the constant friction of low baseline motivation that makes everything feel harder than it should. Serotonin increases, the neurochemical most directly associated with mood stability, the sense of well-being that is not dependent on external circumstances, and the baseline contentment that determines whether ordinary life feels manageable or overwhelming. Norepinephrine elevates, improving focus, sharpening attention, and creating the neurological state most conducive to clear thinking and effective decision-making. And then there is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is the compound that exercise produces in greater quantities than almost any other behavioral or pharmacological intervention, and which functions as the literal biological mechanism through which exercise changes the brain's structure rather than simply its chemistry. BDNF stimulates the growth of new neural connections. It supports the survival of existing neurons. It promotes neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize, adapt, and form new patterns of response to the demands placed on it. The hippocampus, the brain region most directly governing memory formation and emotional regulation, has been shown through neuroimaging research to physically increase in volume in individuals who engage in regular aerobic exercise, while declining in volume in those who remain sedentary. Exercise does not merely make you feel better, it makes your brain physically different. And here is the part that changes the entire motivation framework for every person watching this. The neurological benefits of exercise arrive faster, require less intensity, and persist longer than the aesthetic benefits the fitness industry prioritizes. The mood improvement following a single exercise session is measurable within minutes and persists for hours. The reduction in anxiety symptoms from consistent exercise is observable within weeks. The improvements in cognitive performance, working memory, executive function, processing speed, emerge within a month of regular training and compound progressively with continued practice. The aesthetic results that most people are training for require months of consistent effort and specific nutritional conditions to produce. They are real. They are achievable. But they are the slowest return on the exercise investment, and leading with them as the primary motivation means enduring weeks of effort before the most visible reward arrives. Leading with the neurological and psychological returns means experiencing meaningful benefit from the very first session. The motivation architecture that actually holds. Most people approach exercise motivation as a problem of willpower, a character challenge, the daily battle between the disciplined self who wants to train and the comfortable self who wants to remain still. This framing is not only inaccurate, it is actively counterproductive, because willpower is a finite and unreliable resource. It depletes with use, degrades under stress, and is at its lowest precisely when the competing demands of life are at their highest, which is to say, precisely when the people who need exercise most are least equipped to choose it through sheer force of determination. The people who have built genuinely durable exercise habits, the ones who are still training at 50, 60, 70, not because they are extraordinarily disciplined, but because the practice has become as automatic and identity-consistent as any other established behavioral routine, did not solve the willpower problem. They made the willpower problem irrelevant. They did this by building their exercise motivation on a foundation that does not depend on feeling like training on any given day. A foundation that is constructed from understanding what exercise is actually doing for them in real time, not in 6 weeks, not in 3 months, but today, in the hours following a session. When the primary motivation for exercise is aesthetic, every session that does not visibly produce progress is motivationally costly. The effort was real. The result is not visible yet. The motivation budget absorbs a withdrawal that the outcome has not yet repaid. When the primary motivation for exercise is neurological, when training is understood and experienced as the management of the anxiety that would otherwise accumulate, the sharpening of the cognitive function that the day's demands require, the emotional regulation that determines the quality of every interaction and decision across the following hours. Every session produces an immediate and tangible return. The investment and the return arrive together. The motivation architecture becomes self-sustaining rather than requiring constant external reinforcement. This is why people who shift from training for appearance to training for neurological and psychological function report, something that sounds paradoxical to those still operating within the aesthetic motivation framework. They say training feels less effortful. Not because the physical demand has decreased, often they are training harder than before, but because the psychological relationship with the activity has changed. They are no longer enduring training in pursuit of a deferred, visible result. They are choosing training because the immediate experiential consequence of doing it is preferable to the immediate experiential consequence of not doing it. The anxious afternoon becomes the deciding factor. The foggy morning that clears within 30 minutes of movement becomes the argument the body makes for its own continued investment. The quality of sleep on training nights versus rest nights becomes data that replaces motivational rhetoric. The body becomes its own case for the behavior. That is the motivation architecture that holds, not through strength of character or sophistication of habit, stacking strategy, but through the simple accumulation of evidence that exercise reliably produces an experience of daily life that not exercising does not. The specific shift and what it looked like. When the motivation framework changed for me, when training became primarily about the neurological and psychological experience rather than the physical outcome, several things changed in the practice itself that are worth being specific about. The type of training changed. Not dramatically, not in the direction of less physical demand, but the selection of training modalities shifted toward those that produced the most pronounced and reliable neurological effect, rather than those most directly optimized for aesthetic outcome. Sustained aerobic movement, running, cycling, swimming, rowing, produces the most significant and consistent neurochemical response of any exercise category. The sustained elevation of heart rate over 20 to 40 minutes generates the largest BDNF increase, the most pronounced serotonin and dopamine elevation, and the most reliable acute anxiety reduction of any training modality available. It is the exercise equivalent of the medication that works. Not for everyone, not identically, but consistently enough across populations that the research on it is among the most robust in the entire field of exercise science. Resistance training produces a different but equally significant neurological profile. The acute focus demand of heavy compound lifting, the complete cognitive presence required to safely execute a maximal squat or deadlift, is itself a form of structured mindfulness that the brain benefits from independently of the physical adaptation it produces. The hormonal response, the testosterone and growth hormone surge following resistance training, has direct and documented effects on mood, confidence, and the neurobiological substrate of motivation and drive. The combination of both produces a neurological environment that neither achieves alone. But the specific modalities mattered less than the shift in what I was measuring to evaluate whether a session was successful. Previously, success was measured in weight lifted, calories burned, appearance maintained or improved. A session that met those metrics was successful. A session that did not was a failure, and a failure carried motivational cost. After the shift, success was measured in the quality of the 2 to 4 hours following the session. Was the anxiety lower? Was the thinking clearer? Was the afternoon more navigable? Was the evening more present? These became the metrics. And by these metrics, almost every session was successful, because the neurological response to exercise is remarkably consistent. The brain does not have off days in the same way the musculoskeletal system does. A session that produces a poor physical performance because of accumulated fatigue or suboptimal sleep still produces a meaningful neurochemical response. The metric changed. The failure rate dropped to near zero. The motivation architecture became self-sustaining. What training for the mind actually teaches you about the body. Here is the unexpected consequence of shifting the primary motivation from physical appearance to neurological function, And it is the part of this conversation that most people do not anticipate. The physical results improved, not immediately, not dramatically, but across the months following the shift in motivation framework, the body composition, the strength metrics, and the physical performance markers that I had previously been chasing as primary goals, and not reaching with the consistency that the effort warranted, began moving in directions they had not been moving before. The explanation is not mysterious when the physiology is understood. Training for appearance, particularly within the framework of fitness culture's expectations around transformation timelines, produces a specific and frequently counterproductive stress relationship with exercise. The gap between effort and visible result creates a chronic low-grade stress response. The psychological burden of the body as a project, perpetually assessed, perpetually found insufficient, perpetually requiring more effort to approach the standard, elevates baseline cortisol in the precise way that most directly undermines the fat loss and muscle development it is designed to achieve. Chronic cortisol elevation promotes visceral fat accumulation. It suppresses testosterone and growth hormone. It degrades sleep quality in ways that directly impair the overnight recovery processes through which physical adaptation actually occurs. It creates the physiological conditions most hostile to the aesthetic outcomes being pursued, and it does so in proportion to the psychological stress of the pursuit. Training for neurological function removes the psychological stress architecture that was degrading the physiological environment for physical adaptation. The cortisol associated with the training itself, the acute productive stress of physical exercise, remained. The chronic cortisol associated with the psychological burden of the training relationship diminished. The body responded to the improved hormonal environment by doing more effectively what it had been attempting to do through the entire previous period of effort. This is the deepest irony of appearance-motivated training. The psychological stress of pursuing physical appearance as the primary motivation creates the hormonal environment most likely to undermine the achievement of that appearance. The shift to a motivation framework that reduces that psychological stress, training for function, for neurological benefit, for the quality of immediate daily experience, creates the physiological conditions in which the physical results arrive more readily. The body does better when it is not being punished for not being good enough yet. The practice of exercising for your mind. The practical translation of this shift does not require a complete reconstruction of an existing training approach. It requires a reorientation of attention within whatever approach is already in place. Before training, the orienting question changes from "what am I trying to look like?" to "what am I trying to feel like in 3 hours?" The target shifts from a deferred aesthetic outcome to an immediate experiential one. This single shift in the pre-training cognitive frame changes the motivational relationship with the session before it begins. During training, the attention shifts from external performance metrics, weight on the bar, pace on the treadmill, caloric expenditure on the monitor, to the internal experiential indicators of neurological engagement. The quality of focus during a lift. The specific moment in a run where the transition from resistance to ease occurs. What researchers call the second wind, and what athletes recognize as the subjective experience of the neurochemical shift that sustained aerobic effort produces. The particular texture of mental clarity that follows a training session rather than preceding it. These are not soft metrics. They are real, physiologically meaningful indicators of the neurological response that exercise is producing, and attending to them builds the experiential data set that makes the motivation architecture self-sustaining. After training, a brief, deliberate assessment replaces the habitual mirror check, not as a rigid practice, as a simple question. How is the mind different now than it was an hour ago? The accumulation of honest answers to that question across weeks and months builds the neurological case for continued training that no external motivation source can reliably provide across years of a real human life. The anxiety is lower. Reliably, measurably, consistently lower. The thinking is clearer. The afternoon that was dreaded before training is navigable after it. The interactions that stress was making difficult are accessible to the version of you that exercise produced. That is the return, not the 6-week photograph. The daily quality of the life you are already living. Conclusion. I started working out for my mind because the alternative, continuing to train exclusively for an appearance that was never quite close enough, chasing a physical standard that kept moving forward at exactly the pace my progress moved toward it, was producing a relationship with my own body that was unsustainable, psychologically expensive, and increasingly at odds with the actual quality of daily experience that health is supposed to support. The shift was not dramatic. It was a reorientation of attention rather than a reconstruction of behavior. But the consequences of that reorientation have been more significant than any program change, any nutritional adjustment, or any training variable I have ever modified. The practice became sustainable because its primary return became immediate. The motivation became durable because it was no longer dependent on the deferred arrival of a visible result. The relationship with physical health became genuinely integrated into daily life, rather than existing in perpetual tension with it. And the physical results, the ones that had been the exclusive focus before, arrived more readily in the environment created by the reduced psychological stress of no longer pursuing them as the primary objective. The mind and the body are not separate systems with separate requirements. They are the same system asking to be treated as a whole rather than managed as separate projects, in competition for the same limited resources of time, energy, and attention. Train your mind. Your body will follow, more consistently, more sustainably, and with considerably less suffering than the alternative has ever required. The neurological return on the investment of consistent exercise is the most undervalued asset in human health. It does not photograph. It does not produce content that stops a scroll, but it produces something more valuable than either of those things. A daily experience of being alive that is qualitatively different from what it was before the practice began. That is worth every session, not because of what it builds in the mirror, because of what it builds in the mind that looks into it.